So welcome to the third lecture of the 8th installment of the History of American Architecture lecture series. This is the abbreviated introduction where I simply say, my name is Greg Whitcup, welcome, and a huge thank you to all of our friends at the Michigan Architectural Foundation through their Damian Farrell Architectural Awareness Grants Program for sponsoring the lectures this year. We are really appreciative and find that we have found a great deal of mutual support with them because our goals really are all the same: to increase the awareness of high quality architecture here in Michigan. I'd like to thank our friends again at the Academy of Art for hosting us in Dessau Auditorium, including Laura up there in the AV booth. So we have three programs that are coming up that I would like to get you excited about. During the last 2 weeks of March, we are going to be offering behind-the-scenes tours of what I still will forever call the original Cranbrook School for Boys, even though it's a co-educational building these days, with all the issues related to heightened security around the world. It is getting virtually impossible for a non-student or faculty member to get into these buildings, which is why we've chosen this period while the students are on spring break to really bring people throughout those buildings into a lot of spaces that, quite frankly, I haven't been in for several years myself. This will all then celebrate this original collection of historic prints that George Booth bought to hang on the walls in these spaces that will be on display in the library. Next up, on April 3rd and 4th, Thursday and Friday night, we're going to be having 3 concerts in the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Smith House. Again, a musician that is coming here from Barcelona, Leon Guayart, who is doing a series of concerts in the United States that he calls the Comfort Home Tour. And they are all taking place in amazing architectural environments like the Farnsworth House in Illinois and Eros Arnon's MIT Chapel in Cambridge. So this is going to be an opportunity for you to just kind of sit back for an hour and a half, enjoy the ambiance of the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House. In the evening, when I think Kevin and I would argue, it has, just that most special warmth and light to it. Number 3 is our annual Bowder Lecture. We did a little bit differently this year in that we did the 2024 in the fall, and now we are doing the 2025 on Sunday, April 6th. We're bringing in a pretty interesting poet, wildlife biologist, and self-proclaimed passionate birder. His name is J. Drew Lanham. He's one of the recipients of the so-called MacArthur Genius Grant Award, and is going to be talking about his adventures in the wild, many of them centered around birding, but also layered with the fact that he is a black man and what that means to be, especially a birder that is black in America. So he's titled this talk, Birding While Black. It's going to take place at the Institute of Science, where we'll also have selections of their world-renowned ornithology collection on display as well. That's a free lecture, but you do have to sign up in advance. So, If you're not already on our e-blast list, you can do it from our homepage on our website or by contacting me or Jody or Kevin after the lecture tonight, and we'll make sure you're on that list. So without further ado, it's time to turn the podium over to our curator extraordinaire and passionate guide to all things architectural, including utopias, Kevin.
Thank you, Greg, and great to see you all again. Another Tuesday, another utopia. And today we have made it into the modern era. We have made it to the interwar period, where our first week, we looked at Sir Thomas More coining the word utopia all the way through the sort of eclectic 19th century religious utopias. Last week, we decided if we could create a medieval utopia in the arts and crafts manner. And then today, we are going to see transcontinental battles between architects in Europe, Russia, Germany, Austria, and then architects in the United States with two very different ideas about what is utopia. And as I was working on this week's lecture, I will admit that I was struggling with what is simply a fantasy, what is an architectural idea, what is the sort of dream of a better tomorrow, and what is a utopia. And so we will debate together whether architects were aiming for utopia, it's very helpful when they say they are, or whether architects were just looking for a better future. Now, Lewis Mumford, the great observer of the 20th century and architecture historian and critic, he wrote in 1922, "Utopia has long been another name for the unreal and the impossible. We have set utopia over against the world. As a matter of fact, it is our utopias that make the world tolerable to us." And I think it is this distinctly sort of interwar moment where you have utopias begin to seem less impossible, less sort of floating islands in the sea, or sort of lands that require a great journey. And architects begin to think of utopias as being almost in the very near future. And so, as a reminder, Sir Thomas More coins the word by combining no place and good place. But I think what we're going to see tonight is that architects begin using the term utopia to mean more of a sort of good place and we're almost there place. They begin to have a pretty distinct physical manifestation. Now, I just love this image so much. I just can't stop sharing our little floating city from Gulliver's Travels. But we begin to see the technology catch up with our Renaissance thinkers, and we begin to see architects in Russia propose floating skyscrapers, horizontal skyscrapers lifted above the streets of St. Petersburg. In these first decades of the 20th century, we are marked by a sort of running list of avant-garde movements where architecture had a utopian character based on image making, and where there is a rejection of reality, a rejection of idealism in favor of an almost techno-futurism. Now, in this march of new ideas, we begin to see the hand of the architect really influencing how the public is going to perceive utopia. Here we see a disembodied Le Corbusier presenting his Plan Voisin, and here we see the hanging body of a model maker at the 1939 World's Fair, who is sort of reaching down to perfect the image of America in 1960, just 21 years ahead of the World's Fair. It was designed by a declared utopian, Norman Bell Geddes, and it really is projecting a future that will seem all too familiar to us today, and yet there's all the hallmarks of a utopia in the vision of the World's Fair. It is a social improvement from where we are. It is a world just out of reach. It is a plan. It is a vision, and it is grounded in reality while also being a sort of balm to many of the social ills facing the American landscape after the Great Depression. Now, we just can't stop with the Shakers. They are the great utopians, and I'm reminded again of this balance of the internal life of our utopians versus the manifestation of how we live. And here we see Sister Polly Jane Reed's drawing of the house, sort of surrounded by Mother Wisdom, surrounded by nature, by spirits, by the word of the Lord. And this becomes another way that architects are going to invite us into utopia, is by not just showing us blueprints, not just showing us buildings that we might have, but through other architectural expressions. And so there is a utopian component to the German expressionist movement. This is from a pretty amazing figure, Wenzel Hablich, who's working in Weimar, Germany. He's sort of rooting himself in architecture, but in an architecture that is entirely different from the world as we know it. Now, I was trying to figure out, is he a utopian or is he just an expressionist? I looked at the title of the painting, Utopian Architectural Landscape. And this is seemingly a very far cry from our 19th century well-ordered utopias, like the utopian socialists, the phalansteries, where we have this sort of Versailles of communal living, of cooperative living. It also seems pretty far away from the sort of hand-carved utopia, this idea that if every work or every aspect of work is elevated, if we elevate the craftsman, we will have a utopia. And instead, we are starting to see this new expression. Can utopia be a feeling? Could it be a manifestation of spirituality? And so we see in works like the German expressionists, this sort of utopian architectural landscape that is a little unclear how we'll get there. And we'll look at how architects imagined we would get to this utopia. And then we also see in the Italian futurist a whole different way of getting to utopia, which is an exploitation of the technologies of the 19th century applied to a new sort of radical architecture. It is all component parts that would have existed by 1914, but no one had assembled them quite like this. It's sort of the power of the Hoover Dam, the power of the railroad, the power of the skyscraper and the elevator, all into this new city by this radical group of young Italian architects. And what's interesting about the futurists, this is from 1914, is how they are really focused on urban conditions. And so far, utopias have sort of bounced around, either town or country or town in the country. And tonight, we're going to see a lot of projects that are really centered in cities. And we're also going to see the romance, and this is where I struggle with, is it utopia or is it simply the future? Is it sci-fi? The romance of particularly New York City. And tonight's lecture is going to lead us through a sort of march of avant-garde architects and a march of World's Fair all the way to 1939 when we get to New York, we get to the World's Fair in Queens. In order to get there, though, we have to sort of pass by moments in film and Hollywood where we see the great metropolis, this kind of vision of the future that, again, feels mighty close to where we might be. 1927, why couldn't the future look like this? And then as we arrive at the World's Fair, here the Ford Pavilion swirling out of the building, we have to think again about how architects are showing utopias and the use of the model in gaining in addition to the model, in addition to the novel and the lithograph, we're also seeing films, we're seeing rides, and we're seeing how Norman Bel Geddes will float us above the city of 1960 in order to glimpse utopia. We are stationary, we are in our real world, and we'll get to utopia somehow, but immediately we'll get there riding this sort of 15-minute long Disney-esque roller coaster. And again, I think, gosh, how close are these utopian visions to reality? And I look at the arrival of the King and Queen of England in New York to come to the World's Fair. And the World's Fair in 39 is out in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. It's close to LaGuardia Airport, but of course, His Majesty King Edward has arrived by boat, and so he has to get from the Battery to the World's Fair, and he's going to take Robert Moses's great triumph of infrastructure, an elevated highway. I mean, what could be more of the future? This is something that we've seen promoted in so many utopian plans, and now here we have one in New York. We also have skyscrapers that seem to just be getting higher by the minute. We have airplanes, we have blimps, we have everything that the Victorians were predicting is manifesting itself in Manhattan. So why wouldn't we see a utopia arriving on the doorstep? And I think that it really is part of the sort of interwar period that is combining the effects of World War I, the Great Depression, and the sort of American ingenuity into thinking that utopia must be right around the corner. Now, at the same time, we have Lower Manhattan, we have the King and Queen arriving. We do have these sort of great ambitious productions, like just imagine a musical of the movie Metropolis. It's terrible. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. But it has, again, these amazing sort of futurist sets where if the king and queen are traveling by car now, why won't they be traveling through a sort of airplane within a few years? And I look at this picture of Detroit of the exact same moment with our booming city, an airplane going above it, the sort of arrival of aerial photography as a sort of convention that is familiar now to the viewer. It's not such a novelty. And we also see utopia as existing within this sort of urban condition. If we're achieving things like skyscrapers, elevated highways, travel by air, travel by sea, if we are achieving all of these dreams through technology and through the sort of progressive era, then why are we not sort of studying the very fabric of the city to look towards utopia? And so this becomes something that architects on both sides of the Atlantic are really fascinated in the sort of study of the city in order to project the future of the city. There's a German text, The Beauty of the Metropolis, which you can tell just by its sort of graphic design is rooted in that arts and crafts movement that we saw so much of last week. And the architect Endel writes in The Beauty of Metropolis, "The city gathered in its streets 1,000 beautiful things, innumerable marvels, infinite riches, accessible to all, but seen by very few." And he gets to this point that maybe utopia is actually all around us if we would just look. And he's writing at a moment of extraordinary consolidation of cities. So we have this amazing German word I won't attempt to pronounce, which is the sort of German states begin to incorporate metropolitan areas. You see London become London County Council. You see New York moving from just Manhattan to incorporating Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx into greater New York. And so if cities are going to be the future of life, if that is the way to utopia, well, then the cities better get organized. And so they're getting larger, they're getting more sophisticated. We have the birth of sort of bureaucracy. And so then our city should also get more beautiful. And what could be more iconic and more beautiful than the plan of Chicago by Daniel Burnham? You know, this is probably the triumph of the Beaux-Arts in America, the triumph of the city beautiful movement. And it remains such a powerful image because you have on the shores of Lake Michigan this sort of logical division of industry and culture, of residential zones with public parks, all arranged along the lake, all connected through rail, through streets. It is this sort of utopia of city plans that could be a reality. You know, we get Grant Park out of this, which is no small feat. But I think that it shows the residents of the cities that, hey, architecture, this is possible. We can do this. And I think architects, right before World War I, are really thinking through the ways of how do we get to a utopia. I'm not sure Daniel Burnham ever uses the word utopia. I think he wanted this to happen. Other architects and thinkers, though, use the same language, the same principles of design to propose things like the World City, which would have been built near Trondheim, Norway. And you can see, again, it is this sort of Beaux-Arts plan where you have radial streets, grand civic palaces of, here, the world's intellect. And this is a project, the World City, that will continue for decades among different thinkers. It is this really, it's a vision of the World Wide Web as a building or as a city. And so these are utopian thinkers trying to assemble very specific goals, which is peace through understanding, all of the world's knowledge. Can we index the entire world? Can we have file cabinets that contain everything we need? And can we put it into a world city? And then what is the shape of that city going to be? These are, I think, really utopian ideas. And in the meantime, if we can't build the world's city, well, then we can have the World's Fair. And so World's Fairs were happening throughout the 19th century. I just want to remind us of the one that kicks off the craze, the Crystal Palace Exposition. Everything about the British Empire arranged for you in a great greenhouse, a technological marvel of iron and glass, and then the marvel of all the world's products. Now, I don't think that this is utopia. I think this is amazing, this kind of demonstration of machinery, of art, of textiles, but also of history, of empire, you know, all of the problems and all of the benefits of Victorian England arranged together in a single building. And it starts a craze that will sweep the world, and really the World's Fairs become these kind of pop-up utopias. And I think it's always a balance as to whether something like the American Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia is a utopia, whether what is now Fairmount Park in Philadelphia is trying to show us the best of a future, or whether it's just trying to sort of stake a claim to America's greatness. I'm not sure there's a lot of utopian goals with these 19th century fairs, so much as it is about establishing that you're a city on the global stage, that you're not a nowhere, you are a somewhere, whether that is Philadelphia or something like New Zealand, which has its own World's Fair in 1889, the same year that Paris builds the Eiffel Tower for a World's Fair. And then you begin to get this transfer of architecture because of the World's Fairs, and I just found myself incredibly enchanted by the kind of postmodernist quality. I mean, you could tell me that this is a 1980s shopping center, and I would sort of believe you. This idea that the World's Fair is creating, it's setting a stage of cultural exchange, but also of design exchanges, and also that the World's Fair is going to need some sort of architectural frame. And herein is the repeated problem of utopia, which is when we build it, it does have to become something a little more solid than just a novel, just an image. And so as the World's Fairs are trying to catalog the whole world and trying to share the whole world, they are always interrupted by issues of climate, issues of national participation, issues of commercial intrusion. And so you always have to think of the World's Fairs as, why do we have a Tyrolean village here? Why is the transportation building so Beaux-Art? How exactly, what are the values that you want to share with each of these little pavilions? How are they manifesting these sort of expressions of different architectures? And I think that of all of these sort of smaller World's Fairs, and I apologize to anyone who loves someone that I've just skipped over, the Poor People of San Francisco, 1915, great World's Fair, didn't make it in my lecture. You could just go forever looking at these things, but there are these kind of symmetries. There are these moments that, just as in Chicago, where you have the White City on one side, you have a projection of the future of architecture in the Beaux-Art manner. You then also have just fun. You have crass commercialism. You have the Midway. You have the Ferris wheel. You have the sort of orderly demonstration of a future architecture, and then you also have all the problems of the world. You have sort of imported human villages from the Philippines, from Africa. You have the Belgian Congo represented by actually taking Africans and putting them on display in the World's Fair, and many people die in this sort of exploitation of empire. And so you have these fairs that just simply can't be utopia if you are displaying humans as exhibits. And there is something that is so frenetic about the displays that you end up with these sort of wonderful moments like this, a display of some 5 acres of windmills generating everything from mill power to water pumping to generating electricity, which is then used back in the White City half to illuminate the electrical displays. And then you go inside of the electricity building and you see Nikola Tesla demonstrating fluorescent lighting. I mean, it's kind of amazing what all is at these World's Fairs, but someone has to get these, I think, a little more in order, if you will. Last week we looked at the arts and crafts, and we thought about the ways that sort of handicraft might present a future. And it's really the Deutsche Werkbund, that in 1914 creates a World's Fair that is not quite as eclectic, is not quite as encyclopedic, and is also attempting to create an intersection of architecture, manufacturing, good design, good taste, and nationalism. And it's doing this in a design language that is extraordinarily cohesive, that is cohesive from the scale of the factory down to the scale of the objects that are on display. The Germans at this moment were quite self-conscious about their industry relative to Britain and America, and they also felt threatened by French taste. So they put a World's Fair right in Cologne, close to the French border, and then they sort of synthesize all of the best of Detroit's industrial architecture, all of the best of French design. They bring in elements of the arts and crafts, and they combine, electric kettles with hand-hammered teapots. It's a World's Fair that is showing a way forward for the arts and crafts into the mid-century. It's interesting to think of this building by Walter Gropius, where you have these glass-enclosed staircases, you have this rather formal front, rather influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, compared to something like the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts, which is looking backwards in a way that I don't quite see the Deutsche Werkbund. And you see these German architects who adore Albert Kahn, taking Albert Kahn to what they consider the next logical step. If you have created an architecture that has transformed manufacturing, then let us go ahead and get this architecture into a new aesthetic moment. We don't have to live underneath the Highland Park plant. We can live at the Deutsche Werkbund. What's interesting about this pretty revolutionary fair and display, beyond the fact that every architect who participates in the long 20th century is there. Eliel Saarinen is there, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier. They all go to see the Werkbund show, is that there's already a kind of rejection at the fair. And I don't think our model factory is necessarily a utopia, but I do think that there's a utopia right next door, which is the glass pavilion of the Werkbund exhibition. And if utopias are good places and no places, then the very existence of our little glass pavilion says it is a place. But I think the difference of this building from the main fair buildings and larger fair ideas is that the glass pavilion is a connection point to a future world. The glass pavilion is the realization of a rather abstract idea manifest on the physical grounds of the fair. Now, the glass pavilion is by Bruno Taut, who is working with a number of theoreticians in developing this idea of glass architecture. It is a tour de force of glass bricks, glass mosaics, stained glass, structural glass, and there's even a frieze that runs around with slogans like, "Happiness without glass, how crass." "Colored glass destroys hatred." "Glass opens up a new age." "Brick building only does harm." And the building is literally telling you what to think, and it's sort of priming you for, this is not going to be a display of technological might. This is not going to be a display of sort of medievalism. We're going places. And so when you go in, you are in this sort of temple of glass and water on the first floor, where you have in the stained glass different scenes developed by Paul Scheerbart of a sort of glass utopia. And he uses the term a glass utopia. And then you turn the stairs and you end up on the second floor in this great sort of polyhedron, which is all multiple colors to create different sensations in the viewer. And you have this attempt to create a sort of out-of-body experience through the architecture. Now, Bruno Taut and his associates are really mystical spirits. They are deeply involved in different sort of subsects of theosophy. They have sort of connections to the occult. Bruno Taut is recommended in the magazine of Great German Occults as your best architect to go with. And they're really thinking about how do we use the architecture to show a future where glass architecture is a revolution, where glass architecture is taking us to utopia. And so these gentlemen here are sort of promising a new world based on colored glass sensations and declaring that glass has the potential to be the salvation of society, which, considering that the main factory building is requisitioned by the German military to become a barracks, and the glass pavilion is demolished at the start of World War I think there are two separate ideas of the utopians. And quite quickly from the glass pavilion, we get Paul Scheerbart publishing his book, The Gray Cloth, where an architect flies around a post-war world in a Zeppelin, looking down at glaciers of glass sanatoriums. He's looking at observatories built on lake shores, and he's seeing a world where all of our needs are met through a crystalline glass architecture. It is a pretty ambitious rethinking of how architecture will be built on the world and how we will experience it. And the Little World's Fair Pavilion is just one entry into this new world of glass architecture. Now, lest you think the Germans are the only ones who take sort of mystical principles and apply them into the architecture, someone who is deeply enmeshed in the same line of thinking is in Rochester, New York, Claude Bragdon, one of my sort of strange architectural heroes, where in his series of about 10 books, The Best of which is projective ornament. He will illuminate how to get to the fourth dimension through architecture. So it's a theosophic principle that we can connect to the divine, we can connect to a sort of heaven on earth if we explore those senses which are beyond our understanding. And he says that our architecture has to abandon history, it has to abandon nature, it should look only towards geometries, because what is the fourth dimension but a geometric principle? And so here you see his development of projective ornament, of landscapes where our clothes, our architecture, our textiles, and our lighting is all within this fourth dimension. And I come back again to the sort of futurists who are working at the same moment, 1914, 1915, where one of the futurists, Marinetti, writes, "We will sing of the multicolored and polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern-day capitals. We will sing of the vibrant nightly fervor of arsenals and shipyards blazing with violent electric moons, greedy stations that devour smoke-plumed serpents, factories hung on clouds by the crooked lines of their smoke, bridges that stride the rivers like giant gymnasts, flashing in the sun with a glitter of knives." It is a whole new world imagined by the Italian futurists who have seen pictures of New York. They have seen what American industry can do. And instead of just imagining a world where traffic is separated, they have imagined a whole new world where sort of utopia is achieved by linking our bodies to the factories, by taking the sort of infrastructure of dams and applying it here to a railway station for Milan. Now, I love the quote from Antonio St. Ella, who says, "Elevators should not be hidden in stair corners like solitary worms. Rather, stairs have become useless and must be abolished. Elevators must climb like iron and glass snakes along the front of buildings." So there's this really revolutionary fervor to the Italian futurist. There's also, I think, a real preparation for total war. These are in a way, these are depopulated images. These are for everyone and no one. And the futurists are really proposing a exploitation of technological innovations and also demanding that this happens through total war. That by clearing out our cities, clearing out the population, we will be able to achieve this future. World War I, all of these, the glass architects, the futurists, they are all designing these in a landscape in Europe preparing for total war. Now, the Italian futurists want Italy to join the Allies, but they do want to join the war. As Marinetti writes, "It will, through the glories of war, that true hygiene of the world, militarism, patriotism, and destructive gesture of anarchist, the beautiful ideas which kill, will bring about this future." I mean, it totally changes your thinking from a utopia to a dystopia. And the fact that most of these architects die on the front lines in Austria, it is the great tragedy of war. And I don't think that you can be the same if you have experienced World War I. I don't think that you can see how the horrors of mechanization, the horrors of technological advancement to destroy instead of build, and then be the same architect. And so we'll see this division of architects who make it through the war and architects in Europe versus in America, and the creations that we see in the immediate peace. We begin to see glass architecture rechristened Alpine architecture, where we see the glass architecture now taking us on a journey. And instead of being constructed as a sort of abstract idea, it is illustrated by Bruno Taut of these cities on a hill, these kind of crystalline structures, which I think are actually more similar to Thomas More's vision of utopia as no place and the good place, where again, we're getting there through spiritualism, through elevating of the humankind, but it's no longer really looking like any architecture that we can imagine. And so you see here the spheres, the circles, the wheels. It is this solar glass architecture that has sort of triumphed over the destruction that is on the ground. And what's interesting is Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus, and who will shape so much of 20th century architecture in America and in Europe, he is involved in this crystalline moment. He writes, "The crystalline expression of man's noblest thoughts, his ardor, his humanity, his faith, his religion. There are no architects today. We are all of us merely preparing the way for him who will once again deserve the name architect, for that means Lord of Art, who will build great gardens out of deserts and pile up wonders to the sky." And I think that there's a sort of shift in architects in Europe who have seen the war, where you really have to give up what you were doing before the war. I think the arts and crafts has to die. The arts and crafts seem so sort of diminutive. The idea of going back to these medieval craft guilds feels very retrograde. And now we are seeing the introduction of this sort of crystalline structure. And we see here in the Bauhaus's founding pamphlet this idea of the cathedral and the crystal coming together. And we see these really avant-garde architects in Germany where you have Hans Polzig. I mean, this is terrifying to me. Trypophobia here. If you watched Wicked, this is the Oz's chamber is based on this building, which is constructed in the shell of another building. You have these architects who have radical new visions of how the world should be after World War I. And so you have Erich Mendelsohn, the Einstein Tower, a direct rebuttal to the German phenomena of Bismarck towers, which were meant to be these kind of poles marking the German Empire in every German city, extending all the way to German colonies in Asia and in Africa. Now the Bismarck Tower, which is building that cannot exist after World War I, has become the Einstein Tower, and it is meant to capture solar rays and project them onto the lower part of the building for study. And you have this sort of plastic architecture, which is growing out of Mendelssohn's sketches that he makes as a Russian soldier fighting in World War I before becoming a German and then American architect. And this sort of plasticity that is expressing itself in many different art forms comes into architecture through this sort of utopian vein of Hermann Finsterlin, where it takes this pretty fantastic architecture of sort of, as he says, elementary, protozoan, and radiolarian animal life, and the harmonious hollows of shellfish, and it turns it into a new architectural paradigm. And you think, I've not seen buildings like that. I'm not sure that Hermann really had any great hits, but it is influential. And there are other architects who attempt to build in this new plastic mode, like the Second Goetheanum in Switzerland, where you have the first great concrete architecture, expressive brutalism, but 40 years too early, 1924, an all-concrete building in a little Swiss town. Now, is this theosophical chapel that is dedicated to a secular doctrine of Nietzsche and Goethe, is this utopia, or is it quasi-religious? I think it is probably both. You could read it as either. But I kind of question where you go from here. You know, the Shakers could expand and convert people, but in this architecture of crystals, we keep running into the problem of the image being based in sort of oil painting or in poetry, and then the realities on the ground. I mentioned in the introduction architect new to me, Wenzel Hablich, who is a German architect who, here he's painting before the war, Crystal Castle in the Sea. And then you see after the war, he has large, colorful utopian buildings, or utopian architectural landscape, which for all of its sort of psychedelic speculation, it actually holds true to this kind of landscape painting of the sublime. You have a sort of park in the front left. You have a foreground that is sort of occupiable. You can start to see fountains. You can see plant life. And then you can see the world laid out before you in these utopian shapes, this expressionist shape. And Hablick writes about underwater habitation. He writes about outer space residences. He is really prefiguring science fiction in his utopian paintings. And then he does build buildings. And so you see some of his designs, which begin to become these sort of structurally expressive temporary pavilions, or here a ballroom that would be executed just in paint schemes. And what could be more perfect for this style of architecture than a wallpaper showroom? But then again, always this idea of he's proposed the utopia in the oil painting, and now we have to build his house. And so we visit the home in Germany, and it looks very, mild-mannered, cubist house. And then you go on the inside, and you think, oh yeah. Get me to the paint counter at Lowe's. I mean, what am I doing this weekend? It's pretty amazing. And I think that for can utopia be a private residence? I don't know. But can utopia exist through color theory? Can we take an architectural principle as abstract as color or as abstract as wallpaper and use it to so interrupt our daily life that we get closer to utopia? And I think of William Morris with his wallpaper patterns and the kind of density of what William Morris proposed in the walls of London. And this is, to me, the kind of logical extension. If the wallpaper is a world that you can occupy, why not influence yourself through these intersecting planes of color? And it's very much tied into the Dutch De Stijl movement. I mentioned that we're just going to have this run of avant-garde Europeans, and all of them are going to come crashing back into the United States. But we have the architects of the De Stijl movement seen here in an exhibition. This is the moment of conveying our architecture ideas through World's Fairs and exhibitions. And you see the paintings of Mondrian on the left, and then the architecture of Gerrit Rietveld on the right, where if you look, if you haven't been to Utrecht, get a ticket today. It's an amazing little town, amazing university, and at the end of a very normal sort of post-war garden suburb street, you have this. And if you look at its neighbor, it is an attached row home. I mean, where was the homeowners association? But the house on the right is a 3-story house, and then you have the Schroeder house, a 2-story house, and it has all the same functions of the conventional sort of terraced house, but now, as if it is in a Dutch De Stijl painting, we are going to flip the walls down and out. We're going to flip the table to become the barrier. And so all of our rooms are kind of intersecting in plain space. All of the walls are pure expressions of color. And also the whole house is like this wonderful machine. It is a sort of mechanized painting for living. It's really amazing and much smaller than you would think, when you compare it to the sort of empty space that the architectural drawings have. And so architects like Theo van Doesburg and Cornelius van Esteren are proposing these sort of De Stijl, which just means the style, utopias, where intersecting planes are going to influence our interpretation of the world around us. And I love this idea of a university hall. I think it in many ways sort of prefigures the modern university commons of just, let's have the most beautiful gathering space possible. It's not really a lecture hall. It's not really an event space. It is sort of everything at the university, and we are going to be influenced by these planes of color. Or here, a cafe that van Doesburg designs in France. And this is his only completed architectural expression of the kind of De Stijl. It's within this 18th century square, within a building that he cannot alter the facade. And so you come up for your cafe, and you have these wonderful diagrid of color, and you have this modern furniture in steel. You have a manifestation of the idea of the De Stijl, of this sort of influence of color, influence of planes activation through surfaces. And then you have the combination of theater, performance space, dance hall, cafe, bar. It is this very modern function in an existing building, and it flops as a commercial enterprise. And they start renovating it almost instantaneously. It's completely destroyed by the 1930, and you're looking at photographs of a recreation. And it gets to the issue of, okay, well, how do we get from the scale of these eccentric avant-garde experiments to the scale of city planning? And for someone like Van Doesburg, he was also using a pseudonym to design in every avant-garde style. So if you wanted a German expressionist building, well, just give yourself a new name and design in that style. If you want to do a Beaux-Arts project for Paris, well, just give yourself a pseudonym. And it calls into question the kind of faithfulness that he had to any architectural type, so much as just wanting to get a building built in the post-war period. And I think that it is true of any of these architectural expressions. You know, what is the authentic belief of the architect? Who is really searching for utopia, and who just wants to get something built? And when I read that he had a pseudonym, that he's designing structures under other names in totally different styles, it made me think of someone like Le Corbusier, who I really can't figure out. Is he a great architect and visionary, or is he a nihilist who just wants to make me angry from the grave? And his plan for 3 million inhabitants, which is solving real problems. It is a utopia in that he is proposing a way that we will house the masses of Europe. We will particularly house all of those who lost their housing in World War I, but also those who never had adequate housing. We will give everyone light and air and gardens. We will give everyone sort of free-flowing transportation through superhighways. We will organize the city of 3 million, and it will eliminate all of the ills of the great Victorian city. Gone is any idea of sort of celebrating the medieval street. Instead, we are celebrating technology. We are celebrating the elevator, the steel frame skyscraper. We are going to have towers in the garden, and we'll sit here upon our patio watching airplanes take off and land between the buildings as we exist in this great sort of demonstration of Fordism, of Taylorism, bringing mechanized architecture to reality. Now, everyone gets a hanging garden, everyone gets a villa in the sky, everyone is, happy within the exact stricture of Le Corbusier. Maybe you can choose the color of your front door. He is proposing that we all live in these sort of unit systems, and if I know anything about humans, it is that we don't want to be told exactly what to do. And so, of course, other architects like Eliel Saarinen say, why do I want to live in the machine? Can't the machine just make my existing house much more pleasant? Like I don't know if I want to live in there. And when Le Corbusier presents the Plan Voisin of 1925, on the right you have a collage image that he includes with his exhibition at the 1925 World's Fair in Paris, where that is the existing landscape of Paris on the right. He's proposed a superhighway coming straight through the city, and then the towers in the park. And he will save things like Notre Dame and the Louvre. Other than that, let's start again. Let's destroy it all. Here I am bringing you the future of architecture. And he is bringing it into reality in a World's Fair. So in his little pavilion at the 1925 fair, he's technically outside of the gates because, you have to reject the man in order to advance the future. But he's showing these sort of utopian new architectural ideas. And he is countering the sort of highly aestheticized birth of the Art Deco that is happening in the official World's Fair. I think you do have two sort of semi-utopian ideas, Le Corbusier's Machines for Living In, and then the French capital really overcome in the triumph of the total work of art, where everything has been aestheticized within an inch of its life, where everything is as beautiful as possible, where all of the allied arts are working with the architecture. It is a transformational moment for the sort of story of global architecture, because this is the World's Fair that gives us both the term Art Deco and also gives us, it comes straight to Manhattan and gives us Rockefeller Center. It is hugely influential for its aesthetic qualities, much more so than any utopian idea that the World's Fair had. Everything was expensive, everything was handmade. I mean, it was kind of imperial aesthetic handicraft, except for our radical little Soviet structure. And so our last kind of radical avant-garde European utopian idea that we have to briefly outline are the liberated architects of Soviet Russia, this brief flash of time between the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalin's creation of Soviet realism, where you have these fantastical structures that I think do the most dreaming of how we could combine technology, modern materials, modern functions. These are all worker halls. These are, celebrations of the laboring class. I think if you showed a worker William Morris's Utopia and then showed a worker our Russian constructivist utopia, I think this is much more exciting, and they're going to try and build it. They're going to try to make this a reality. And so you have projects like Tatlin's Monument, which is meant to be a direct rebuttal to the Eiffel Tower. It is meant to be built. Here it is in a photo montage in St. Petersburg, and within this great steel structure would be floating theaters in perfect spheres, would be worker halls in perfect cubes. So we're beginning to get the sort of Platonic solids as well as the social aims in a revolutionary new architectural form. This is the moment from which El Lissitzky designs his horizontal skyscrapers. This is, I think, Da Vinci level experimentations going on over in the Soviet Union. And you have these ideas that are going to really take the principles of the communist utopia with the Russian Revolution and building technologies and give us something that's totally new. Of course, by 1930, this is all being called into question, and Stalin is sort of eliminating this entire strain of architecture from the discourse. And so as we zoom towards 1939, and we think about how are these revolutionary avant-garde architects ever going to influence the American landscape, we come back to something as humble as the Garden Suburb. But now it's Garden Suburb in, if you like it, machines for living in. If you don't like it, the English said, a little Arabian stage set, where they compare this to the sort of desert architecture of the Middle East because of its sort of blank expression. But what the Weissenhof Siedlung, or the Weissenhof Garden Suburb, is doing is it's showing a combination of social housing, communal housing, shared housing, worker housing, with the leading German architects of the day. So Le Corbusier, and continental architects. You have Gropius, Mies, Le Corbusier, Marcel Breuer, all designing pieces of this World's Fair that exist entirely as a living neighborhood. And so if you go to Stuttgart, you can go and tour Le Corbusier's building. The rest are still worker housing. And you have the Germans sort of proposing, we can make this happen. We don't have to live in crystalline structures. We can make a new architecture, efficient, abstract, and we'll do it first at the World's Fair. You have Mies van der Rohe's transformational pavilion for Germany at the Spanish World's Fair, where there is nothing on display. It is just architectural space. It is literally a pavilion in floating space that gives room for the sort of Weimar officials to meet the King and Queen of Spain and experience pure architectural abstraction and space. And this is the kind of wave that comes to America in exhibitions like the Museum of Modern Art's International Exhibition, where we get the international style coined. And this show travels around to 16 different cities across the US and has a book. And you can see just from the photographs that what makes modern architecture, according to the New York Museum of Modern Art, are flat roofs, ribbon windows, concrete, raising the building up on columns, pilotis. free. It is the avant-garde crashing into the American conscious. And when we compare just this moment, sort of 1928, 1929, we have Eliel Saarinen building Saarinen House here at Cranbrook, which is a kind of Art Deco-influenced arts and crafts project, with Walter Gropius building his house at the Bauhaus, or Mies doing the Barcelona Pavilion. And we begin to see the way that these ideas from Europe might come to an America that's probably not ready. And so here we have a project, a communal residence that was meant to be a utopia, a sort of Soviet utopia in the style of the Bauhaus in Le Corbusier's floating block. And let's compare it to the most revolutionary housing in America from the same year, Radburn, the garden city for the motor age. And I do this a little bit to be funny, because it is funny. The sort of actual revolutionary people making a revolutionary architecture, but then the Americans figuring out a way how we can have our democratic version of communal living where technology and domestic bliss can intersect. And so with Radburn Garden Suburb, you begin to see the acknowledgement that cars are here to stay, that cars are going to be the machine that changes the great American landscape, but it doesn't necessarily have to change the look of our communities. And so in this amazing pamphlet, the blue are all of the play areas for children, the schools, and then the yellow are the vehicular roads, and then houses are set with access to both directions. And so it provides a model for worker housing for American suburban living that will separate these two incompatible uses, where here we have the children of the future running through this very scenic stone bridge, and the cars are fully separated. And this model is a direct growth from the kind of arts and crafts movement from the garden suburb. It is meant to show a way of how American cities can provide a pedestrian-oriented life, how we can maintain the town square, and how we can also be modern people. It is a totally different but sort of equally revolutionary way of living. And the fact that it doesn't look revolutionary is because I just don't think there's an appetite for a revolutionary house in America. And if you don't believe me, take a drive anywhere in America. Most of us still live in traditional architecture. Most of us, modernism does not win in the residential design field. And so these avant-garde experiments that are coming out of Europe have to be digested for an American public. The architect can love it all they want, but if no one wants to build it, then how do you change architecture? And it is again through the World's Fairs that changed England in 1851, that changed the arts and crafts in 1914. Now, two great American World's Fairs will introduce a very eager public to avant-garde modern architecture, to better living through chemistry, through these kind of experiments in temporary design that will point a way towards an American utopia. So are these World's Fairs utopia? I don't know. I mean, they're temporary, they're festive, they're moments in time. I think they're very inspiring. I think they're very colorful. And I think what's critical about these World's Fair, in particular, the Chicago Century of Progress and the New York World of Tomorrow, is that they're happening in Depression-era America, in between two world wars, and that they are celebrating American commerce, industry, capitalism, and American design. And so you have in the cover for the Chicago Fair, you have the log cabin where Chicago started. Then you have this kind of 19th century city. Then you have the future, the city of Oz on the background. And right at the gate, you come in through these flags, this ceremonial. You are entering into a celebration, yes, of Chicago's history, but also a celebration of our future. These amazing flagpoles outside of the Sears Pavilion. Then you have Albert Kahn giving us the great Ford Rotunda that will move to Dearborn after the show. And then you have the big three history, sort of shaping the aesthetic of the fair with these buildings that are a little bit more exciting than what was standard, but also are not that far into the future. And so the Chicago Fair is the sort of primer that maybe we are ready for the future. But in the House of the Future, the House of Tomorrow by George Keck, yes, it's made of glass. Yes, it's surrounding a steel frame. It has air conditioning. It has an open floor plan. It has a hangar for the family airplane. But it's also a kind of bourgeois home. I mean, it is a home that requires a staff. It's a home that has a pretty conventional type of arrangements. It even has a conservatory. I mean, what could be more Victorian than having your own conservatory? And you compare it to the Crystal House, which has the amazing Buckminster Fuller car down in the garage. And we're starting to see architecture that looks revolutionary, but is actually sort of reinforcing American domestic design. And you compare that to something like the Dymaxion House, and Bucky Fuller and his experiments in utopia will be a part of next week's lecture. But you are seeing the intersection of technology, innovation, war technology coming into the American home. But this is celebrating a century of progress. So there really are as many demonstrations of the past as there are of the future. And we have to head to Manhattan and look out from, I think this is taken from the New York Wanamaker's, looking out towards Queens to see on the horizon the world of tomorrow. And so in the back of that black and white image, you can see the pylon and hemisphere, the icons of the New York World's Fair. Now, the New York World's Fair is a direct response to Chicago, but it is even more commercial than Chicago's was, even less sort of investment from the traditional vendors of the World's Fairs, and more about American industry. It will be built on the old ash heaps of Flushing Meadow, sort of iconic for their role in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And so these Mount Corona ash dumps and the Flushing River wetland, which is, a super fun site, will be transformed in about 5 years into the world of tomorrow. And the World's Fair is really themed towards this post-Depression and what will be a post-war American vision. Now, they couldn't have known that war was right on the horizon. They try everything, a lagoon of peace, a hall of nations. But they are building this World's Fair at a very critical moment in world history because you have this advertisement, full frontal assault of American architecture, American industry, an American vision of peace that is probably best embodied by the icon of the fair, which is occupiable. You go in through at the time, the world's largest escalator in the base of the pylon to a double-height circular room where you, as these models from Vogue, can look down on Democracy by Henry Dreyfuss, which really looks like a garden city, a pretty conventional representation. Above you are projected Kodak images of both stars and the city of the future. And Henry Dreyfuss writes to you in the catalog that the city of tomorrow, Democracy, can be yours today. Why not start tomorrow? There is this sort of optimism to the pylon in Perisphere. And then when you exit it, you are exiting into a sort of wonderland of the very near future, whether that is the kind of division of cars and pedestrians that we have seen every architect imagine so far, or whether that is the sort of wonder of U.S. history framed with U.S. future, where you have a statue of George Washington celebrating 150 years of U.S. history, overlooking the four freedoms as sort of allegorical sculptures. Then you have the traditional halls of products and things like a bedding exhibit, a mohair exhibit, the history of the jacquard weave, or the revolving device for exhibiting colored paper wrappings and cellophanes, or one of my favorite, woolens, where you have at the top the sheep and then the modern woolens going down to become jackets. And the difference here is that it's almost entirely U.S. Companies and entirely U.S. markets. It is this advertisement where if we built the Hoover Dam in 1936, well, why don't you come and visit the hydroelectric dam at the World's Fair, where you can go through the representation of the dam, and then you can see models of engines, models of the workings of the hydroelectric dam. When you come back outside, you will see a sort of capillary mercury tubes lighting up the entire World's Fair. Einstein turned on the illumination the first night of the fair with a lecture on cosmic rays. And it is, again, this idea that, hey, our future is bright and it is right in front of us. And you have things like the Lucky Strike cigarette building. Behind it is the Wonder Bread building. If you think it looks like a Wonder Bread wrapper, the Wonder Bread wrapper looks like the 1939 World's Fair. This comes first, and it's so iconic that they then bring it back into production. And so it is this vision of a very near utopia that is sort of expressed in all elements, whether it's the history of glassmaking or whether it's the aqua theater, anything that can be appropriated to come to the World's Fair, we will. And the high point for most visitors is the General Motors Futurama show, which is developed by a consummate utopian designer, Norman Bell Geddes, who the month that L. Rod Hubbard dies, the month that the Roycrofters sink on their Lusitania, Norman Bell Geddes came out at age 21 with a magazine called InSwitch, in which he will talk about whatever he wants. And he is a futurist, a utopianist who really dominates our understanding of the 1939 World's Fair. And he does it through models. Now, Norman Bell Geddes is a frustrated architect. He wanted to be a licensed architect, and he's embarrassed sort of repeatedly by the Architecture Accreditation Board in Albany, never becomes a licensed architect, so he must be a designer who works on the scale of industrial design and model making. But within the context of the World's Fair, he takes the sort of curvaceous architecture of Mendelssohn and the German Expressionist. He takes this idea of theater into architecture. No matter which way you approach the General Motors building, you are going to see a curve. So the building is always pulling you towards the front. And then you're given the three choices of lines, which are there day and night for 2 years of the fair. And then you snake up this line. I mean, by the time you turn that last corner, you must be so excited. And you go through this cut in the building, and then you sit down and you are ready to float 15 minutes above an American city in 1960. And you are floating above a model that is exploiting the sort of detail of the model, exploiting the kind of near utopian ideas on display. And Norman Bell Geddes has predicted here a world of interconnected highways, a world of skyscrapers, a world of decentralized suburbs, a world of higher education for all, a world of nylon stockings and TVs and microwaves. There are so many things that are here that will come true, and you have had the pleasure of experiencing it all a little bit early. And then when you come out of this display, you end up in a full-scale mock-up of the city of the future with the divided highway with all of our General Motors products down below. And I think that it shows this sort of excitement that is the potential of the American dream. And so this is not utopia because it doesn't exist. I mean, it's a momentary blip. But he is showing us that we are mighty close to utopia. And there's only one thing that can get in the way of us and sexy scarecrows, which just had to include this. That's the Wonder Bread Pavilion. And that, of course, is another total war. And so we have here at the end of the World's Fair, by the time that it reopens for the 1940 season, we have changed our theme from the world of tomorrow to for peace and freedom. And if here we see FDR opening the World's Fair in front of a crowd of thousands, we now, instead of seeing the British building and the Italian building and seeing the Soviet building has been completely dismantled. And so once the Soviet Union signs a pact with Hitler, they're asked to leave the fair, and they reopen here with picnic grounds. And so you begin to see the utopia collapse in on itself. Hitler had threatened to build a building there at the 39 World's Fair. Once he invaded Poland, Germany was uninvited. So there was never a Nazi pavilion here. But the Soviets, they were going to be our friends. Then they signed the pact, and they'd destroy their building. You have Alvar Aalto and the birth of the sort of Finnish aesthetic, entirely funded by the US State Department. They are going to get Finland on our side through the World's Fair and just incidentally launch the Savoy vase for the American audience. And architects like Lucio Costas and Oscar Niemeyer, communist in Brazil, are invited to design the World's Fair buildings because they are communist, and we need to indoctrinate them to our way of thinking, get them to New York, and we will smooth out the sort of communist architecture of South America. There is this undercurrent that is brooding with this vision of utopia. And so as you look at the kind of bold predictions of the 1939 World's Fair, we are also seeing again that utopia is going to struggle to be birthed, that even if Norman Belgettis is right about so many things in Futurama, and even though tens of thousands of guests will leave the World's Fair with a button that says, "I have seen the future is going to be more complicated than when you build it out of gypsum board, ticky-tack, and wire. Next week, we will see if America can become a post-war utopia, and then we'll see what architects do when they decide that maybe the shopping mall and Disney World are not utopia. Thank you, everyone.